Colleen Stan was 20 years old and living with friends in Eugene, Oregon, when she planned a trip to visit another friend in Northern California for a birthday celebration. The route was familiar, and she'd hitchhiked before. Back then, it wasn't so unusual, especially in a place like the Pacific Northwest, where the culture of the open road was still romanticized. Colleen believed she could distinguish between good and bad people. She even turned down 2 rides that afternoon, sensing something was off. But then a blue Dodge Colt pulled over. Inside was a young man, his wife, and their baby girl in the back seat. It felt safe. The presence of a family disarmed her. How could anything go wrong? Colleen got in, and that would be her last free decision for the next 7 years. An innocent family. Colleen Stan was born on December 31st, 1956, in Oregon. She was a winter baby, quiet, thoughtful, the kind of young woman who often smiled with her eyes more than her mouth. By the time she turned 20, she'd already lived more than most people do in twice that time. She was smart, cautious, and fiercely independent. She wasn't reckless. She was careful, especially when it came to hitchhiking. On the morning of May 19, 1977, Colleen set out from her home in Eugene, Oregon, with a plan. She was going to surprise a friend in Northern California for her birthday. It was a 600-mile trip, but Colleen had done this before. She stuck to the rules she trusted. Don't get in a car that gives you a bad feeling. By mid-afternoon, she was in Red Bluff, California, over halfway there. She'd already turned down 2 rides. One driver felt off, and the other gave her the chills. And then, just when she was starting to worry she might not make it in time, a small blue Dodge Colt pulled over. Inside was a young couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker, and in Janice's arms, a baby girl, 8 months old. "Oh," Colleen smiled and stepped into the car. At first, nothing seemed unusual. There wasn't much conversation, but it was quiet in a way that didn't feel right. Awkward pauses, stolen glances. Colleen couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cameron kept looking at her through the rearview mirror. When they stopped at a gas station, Colleen went inside to use the restroom. As she washed her hands, something stirred in her gut, panic, almost instinctual. A voice inside her screamed, "Jump out the window, don't go back." But she did what most of us would do. She ignored it and walked back to the car. Minutes later, Cameron turned off the main road and onto a remote dirt path, surrounded by nothing but thick trees and silence. Janice got out of the car with the baby, and in an instant, the air changed. Cameron climbed into the back seat, pulled out a knife, and pressed it to Colleen's throat. He blindfolded her, gagged her, and cuffed her wrists together. Then, from beside her, he lifted a strange wooden object, the box. Heavy, with hinges and a hole cut out for the neck. He slid it over her head. It was tight. She couldn't see, could barely breathe. The world went black, hot, and silent. The car started again. When they reached the Hooker's home in Red Bluff, Cameron led Colleen, still handcuffed and blindfolded, down into the basement. There, he ordered her to undress. She stood silently as he chained her wrists to the ceiling, her feet barely balanced on a small ice chest. Without warning, he kicked the chest away. Colleen hung there, terrified and screaming. Cameron responded with a whip and told her to be quiet. She cried quietly, her body aching, the wooden box still enclosing her head like a coffin. That night, Cameron left her there, arms suspended, wrists burning, vision blacked out, the weight of the box pressing her neck down into her chest. He fastened her to a crate, latching her arms to the side, and left her like that until morning. Back in Eugene, no one knew she was missing. Her visit was meant to be a surprise, and the friend she was going to see had no idea she was ever on her way. 4 days passed before anyone noticed Colleen Stan was gone. At first, her friends assumed she'd just stayed a bit longer in California. Maybe the birthday trip had turned into a spontaneous weekend away. But by the 4th day, worry gave way to dread. Her roommates called her parents in a panic. Had she stopped there on her way home? Had they heard from her at all? They hadn't. Her mother made it clear from the very beginning that this wasn't just a case of someone walking away or needing space. She knew her daughter's habits, her routines, the small gestures that showed she cared, especially the way she always made sure to call or let someone know where she'd be. Colleen's parents didn't wait for the police. They got in their car and started driving. 700 miles between Eugene, Oregon and Red Bluff, California, stopping at gas stations, diners, small-town police stations, asking strangers if they'd seen a young woman with long brown hair, soft eyes, and a warm smile. But days passed, and Colleen was nowhere to be found. The company, Colleen Stan, had vanished without a trace. To law enforcement, it looked like she'd simply walked off the face of the earth. But Colleen wasn't lost. She was underground, naked, blindfolded, trapped inside a wooden box no bigger than a coffin. For 23 hours a day, Colleen lay inside that box, her legs cramped to her chest, her body wrapped in heat and silence. She was only let out for an hour a day. During that hour, she was tortured. Cameron would threaten her, saying that if she screamed, he would cut her vocal cords. And she believed him. Above ground, life continued. Cameron went to work, and Janice stayed home with the baby. Neighbors had no idea there was a second woman in the house, one they'd never seen. One who had no name, no voice, no story. Every evening, Cameron returned home and walked down to the basement. He called it his workshop. There, he chained Colleen to homemade devices. He whipped her, electrocuted her, and photographed her. Sometimes Janice helped. Other times she just watched. And every night after the torture, Colleen was returned to her box. Her family held on to hope, but that hope was dimming. Months passed with no sign of her. No contact. Her mother mailed her dental records to the authorities just in case a body turned up. Back in the basement, time twisted. The days melted into each other. Colleen's senses blurred. She hadn't seen daylight since the afternoon she got into the car. That changed in January 1978. 8 months after her abduction, Cameron removed her blindfold for the first time. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness of the room, the cold cement walls, the tools, the chains. She wasn't free, but at least she could see the place she had been trapped in. That illusion of freedom would be short-lived. That day, Cameron opened a small storage closet beneath the stairs. Inside were stacks of BDSM magazines. He handed her one. In it, an article about a secret slave ring talking about owners, contracts, obedience, and punishment. Then he gave her a pen. He called it the contract, a binding agreement between a master and his slave. According to Cameron, he wasn't acting alone. He worked for a secret organization called the Company, a powerful network of sadistic slave owners. If Colleen didn't sign, he said, she would be sold to someone far worse. The contract required her total submission, physically, emotionally, and legally. She was no longer a person. She was property. Colleen signed, and then Cameron signed too, using the alias Michael Powers. And just like that, the fantasy became reality. Colleen Stan no longer existed, not on paper, not to the law, not even to herself. She was now the legal slave of a man who believed he owned her soul. By the time Colleen signed the contract, the transformation was complete. She was no longer Colleen. Cameron called her Kay, not a name, just a letter. This was his way of stripping her identity and reminding her that she now belonged to him. He told her that the company was always watching, that they knew everything. If she tried to escape or told anyone the truth, they would hunt her down. And worse, her family would die. And Colleen believed him. After the signing, her conditions changed, but only slightly. The blindfold was no longer constant. She was given clothes. She could sometimes stand, sometimes move, but the core of her existence remained the same. A wooden box, locked shut for 23 hours a day, hidden beneath the floor. 8 months after her abduction, Cameron raped her for the first time. A year later, in May 1978, the hookers moved into a mobile home. Colleen went with them, still a prisoner. Cameron built a new box to fit underneath their waterbed. It became her new world. While Cameron went to work and Janice cared for their children, Colleen was locked beneath their bed, her body just inches away from the feet of a sleeping family. For the next 2 years, she would live almost entirely inside that space, emerging only when Cameron allowed it. And when she did, it was to cook, clean, tend to the garden, and help raise their newborn child. Over time, her movements became more routine. Sometimes she was allowed outside. Sometimes she was left unsupervised with phones and other neighbors, surrounded by a world that might have helped her. But Colleen never took action. The threat of the company loomed too large. She believed in it completely, and in a twisted way so did her captors. Cameron often spoke of building a dungeon, a more permanent facility where he could keep multiple slaves. He even forced Colleen to help dig right there in the backyard under a shed. It wasn't a fantasy to him, it was preparation. "Yes, Mom, I'm fine." By 1980, Colleen had been imprisoned for nearly 4 years, and in that time, something strange had started to happen. Cameron trusted her, at least enough to test the boundaries. He let her make a phone call. He said it would be monitored, that the company would be listening. One wrong word, and everyone she loved would die. So, Colleen called home. The only one there to pick up was her youngest sister, Bonnie. It had been 4 years since anyone had seen or heard from her. Her family had assumed she was dead. The call lasted only a few minutes. Colleen didn't say where she was, nor did she explain what happened. She told them she was okay, that she loved and missed them, but that was all. Her family was stunned, but without any details, and with Colleen insisting she was safe, they chose not to involve the police. Some feared she had joined a cult. Others were simply afraid of pushing too hard and losing her again. After 4 years of silence, they weren't ready to risk another disappearance. So they did nothing. And once again, Colleen went back to the box. After the phone call home, things carried on as they had for years. Routines of silence, captivity, and control. Then, without warning, Cameron did something unimaginable. He allowed Colleen to visit her family. He drove her to their home unannounced, showing up on the doorstep with no advance call, no warning. Her family hadn't seen her in 7 years, and now, standing in front of them, was their daughter. Thin, pale, quiet, and a man who introduced himself as her boyfriend. He called himself Mike Powers. Cameron stayed only briefly, telling them he had a business convention and would return the next day. He left Colleen there for a single day under the illusion of normalcy. Her family was stunned, overwhelmed with joy, but also with confusion. She looked different, hollowed out, emotionally distant. But they didn't press her for answers. After so many years of silence, they were terrified of saying the wrong thing and pushing her away again. They accepted her version of the story, even if it didn't make sense. No one knew what questions were safe to ask. The next afternoon, Cameron returned. He told them they were moving soon and promised to share new contact information once they were settled. As he and Colleen prepared to leave, they took a photo. One final image before she disappeared again. Colleen stood beside her captor, smiling faintly, her arms loosely draped around him. Back at the mobile home, the brief illusion of freedom vanished. As soon as they returned, Cameron locked Colleen back in the box. It was as if the visit had never happened. He was afraid, perhaps, that he had given her too much freedom, that the trip home, the outside world, the human contact, it might have awakened something in her. And so, to reassert control, he buried her again. For the next 3 years, she returned to the same hollow routine. 23 hours a day inside the box. 1 hour out to eat, use the bathroom, or be punished. She was forced to relieve herself in silence, using a bedpan maneuvered beneath her in the dark. The body adapts to unimaginable things when there's no other choice. But in 1983, something shifted. Janice Hooker, who had long played the role of silent accomplice, developed an interest in Christianity. She began reading the Bible. Colleen, already a devout believer, found a fragile connection with her through shared scripture. Slowly, the women formed a bond, quiet, cautious, but real. Soon, Janice began letting Colleen out of the box more frequently. They read and prayed together. Eventually, Cameron allowed the two of them to attend church services on weekends. It was the first time in years that Colleen was seen publicly by anyone outside the Hooker household. Neighbors, who had assumed she'd moved away long ago, were stunned to see her again. Thin, quiet, obedient. Cameron's attachment to Colleen deepened. He began referring to her not just as his slave, but as his future second wife. He allowed her to get a job cleaning rooms at a local motel. For the first time since 1977, Colleen moved through the world under her own name. She walked freely, saw people, and even had a paycheck. And still, she didn't run. Because even then, she still believed the company was watching. But Janice had begun to break. The guilt, the years of complicity, the weight of scripture, it became too much. In August 1984, she told Colleen the truth. The company wasn't real. Cameron had made it all up. Every threat, every warning, every promise of retribution was a lie. He had never been part of anything. He was just a man, a manipulator, and a monster. It was the only thing Colleen needed to hear. The next morning, she gathered her courage, walked to a nearby bus station, and called Cameron from a payphone. She told him she was leaving, that it was over, and then she got on the bus and she went home without any police involved. She simply returned, as if from a long absence. She said nothing about the years she spent in darkness. To her family, to friends, to authorities, she did not explain. And in the weeks and months that followed, she even stayed in contact with Cameron. She called him regularly, convinced that he could change, that he might find redemption, confession. In the fall of 1984, Janice Hooker kept going to church, even after Colleen had disappeared from her life. She sat quietly in the pews, holding a burden she could no longer carry. And then on November 8th, during what would be her final visit, Janice asked the pastor for a private moment. She said she needed to confess. The words came out slowly, fragments at first, so horrific and surreal that the pastor stopped her. He couldn't hear the rest alone, so he brought in help and eventually called the police. When officers arrived, Janice told them everything. About the box, the torture, about the years Colleen Stan had spent living underneath her bed. At first, they didn't believe her. The details were too grotesque and theatrical. It didn't feel real. But 4 days later, they found Colleen, living 570 miles away, working, functioning, smiling. To the outside world, she was just another woman picking up the pieces of life. Her appearance complicated things. Investigators doubted Janice's story, until Colleen confirmed it. They had no choice but to believe it. Cameron Hooker was arrested and taken into custody. Janice, because of her cooperation and because she was the one who had finally broken the illusion, was granted immunity. In exchange for her testimony, she would never face a single day in prison. As detectives searched the Hookers' 2 homes, the truth spilled out of closets, drawers, and floorboards. They found leather restraints, head boxes, and hooks embedded in the ceilings. They discovered stacks of violent bondage magazines and a collection of photographs, graphic, cruel, of Colleen during her captivity. One roll of film hadn't even been developed yet. It was no longer a question of if it happened, but how. News of the case spread quickly as it made headlines across the country. People were fascinated, horrified, and speechless. The idea of a woman being hidden in plain sight, under a bed, in a mobile home, raising a child that wasn't hers, attending church services with her captors, felt like something from fiction. But this was real. The trial began in December 1984. Cameron Hooker faced more than 18 charges: kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and multiple sexual offenses. He pleaded not guilty to all of them. His defense was simple. He claimed everything had been consensual. He pointed to the photo, Colleen smiling beside him at her parents' house. He referenced her silence during the visit, the lack of any attempt to run. He reminded the jury that she had a job, freedom of movement, and access to people. That she could have said something but never did. Even after her release, she had called him. To Cameron, it wasn't captivity, it was a relationship. But the prosecution laid out a different reality. Colleen hadn't stayed because she wanted to. She stayed because she had been psychologically crushed. Because for 7 years she believed that a secret organization would hunt her down if she ever disobeyed. That her family would die if she spoke the truth. Because, after years of isolation, pain, and terror, she no longer trusted her own instincts. The term was psychological slavery. Another more haunting one, Stockholm Syndrome, a condition in which hostages develop a twisted bond with their captors. The line between fear and dependence becomes blurred, and affection becomes survival. In September 1985, Cameron Hooker stood trial once again, this time facing the full weight of what he had done. The first witness called was Janice Hooker. She had once helped Cameron kidnap Colleen Stan, keeping it a secret for years. But now, she was the one testifying against him. To convey the scale and intensity of the torture Colleen endured, the courtroom was filled with physical evidence, props from the Hooker's home. The jury was shown the restraints, the head boxes, the handwritten contract that marked the moment Colleen surrendered to the illusion of the company. One of the boxes had been reconstructed to match the one built beneath the waterbed. The jury wasn't just asked to imagine it. They were invited to step inside. A replica of the backyard dungeon, dug by Colleen's own hands, was also presented. But that's not all Janice talked about. Long before Colleen Stan stepped into the Hooker's car, another young woman may have fallen into Cameron Hooker's orbit, only this time she never returned. Her name was Marie Elizabeth Spanhake, a bright and outgoing 22-year-old who disappeared without explanation in early 1976 from Chico, California. Petite, brown-haired, and full of youthful energy, Marie had recently moved to the area and was last seen leaving a pet store near the center of town. Witnesses claimed she had been in the company of a young couple accompanied by a baby, and from that moment forward, she simply ceased to exist in the public record. There were no calls, no sightings, and no remains. Just a quiet vanishing that eventually faded into the growing list of missing women in Northern California during that decade. However, at the time, there were no concrete leads and no named suspects. Marie's case slipped into the cold files, stalled by the absence of physical evidence and the overwhelming volume of similar disappearances across the state. It remained dormant until nearly a decade later, when Janice Hooker began her confession. During a series of interviews with investigators following Colleen Stan's escape, Janice described in disturbing detail the captivity and torture her husband had inflicted on Colleen. But it was what she revealed next that shifted the tone of the investigation entirely. Janice claimed that Colleen wasn't Cameron's first victim. Years earlier, she said, her husband had kidnapped another young woman. According to Janice, this unknown woman had been kept bound and restrained, subjected to Cameron's violent fantasies, and had cried out for help in vain. One day, without warning or explanation, she was gone. Janice claimed that Cameron told her he had taken care of it. She never saw the woman again. Though she couldn't remember a name or an exact date, her account drew immediate attention to the case of Marie Spanhake. The details aligned disturbingly well. The location, the time frame, the profile of the victim, and even the pattern of using a baby and a young couple to disarm a lone hitchhiker all matched the method used to lure Colleen Stan just 1 year later. Investigators believed the circumstantial evidence was too consistent to ignore. Janice's statement lacked crucial specifics, and without a body or a direct confession, prosecutors had nothing concrete to build on. Marie's case remained technically unsolved, a haunting shadow beneath the already grotesque story unfolding in the courtroom. Yet, to many involved, there was little doubt that she had been Cameron Hooker's first known victim, and that Colleen Stan had narrowly escaped the same fate. The implications were as disturbing as they were tragic. If Janice's story was true, then Marie Spanhake had been the first, and Colleen had been spared only because she had been kept alive long enough to believe she couldn't leave. It also raised uncomfortable questions about what might have happened if authorities had connected the dots sooner. Had Marie's disappearance been fully investigated, had warning signs been heeded or suspicions followed, perhaps Cameron Hooker would have been caught before Colleen ever set out on that road in 1977. Instead, Marie vanished. Her name remained absent from headlines for nearly a decade, and while her case was never officially closed, her story became inextricably linked to another young woman who would endure unspeakable suffering but survived to tell the tale. Then Colleen Stan took the stand. She spoke in detail, recounting 7 years of captivity. Every moment, every manipulation. Her voice didn't waver, but her testimony left a mark. Even seasoned court staff found themselves struggling to sleep afterward, haunted by the sheer brutality of her experience. The defense clung to one argument, that it had been consensual, that Colleen could have left and didn't. They pointed to the love letters she had written to Cameron, letters that seemed to suggest a deep emotional connection. The defense called them proof, but Colleen explained that the letters were survival. The kinder she was, the less brutal he became. The trial dragged through emotional terrain. The defense returned again to the day Colleen visited her family, unaccompanied, unsupervised. A full 24 hours with people who loved her. Yet she hadn't said a word. This, to the jury, was difficult to reconcile. To help explain, the prosecution called psychologists to the stand. They laid out how sudden trauma, prolonged isolation, and a fabricated omnipresent threat can erode a person's will. They described psychological captivity, emotional paralysis, the slow breakdown of autonomy that leaves a victim unable to distinguish freedom from fear. After 3 weeks of testimony, Cameron Hooker was called to the stand. He admitted to the kidnapping, but claimed that after a few months, Colleen fell in love with him, and that everything after that was mutual. The defense even brought in their own expert to question whether a person could truly be held prisoner by invisible chains. 5 weeks after the trial began, the jury went into deliberation. It took them nearly a week to reach a verdict. Cameron Hooker was found guilty of kidnapping, rape, and multiple counts of sexual assault. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. His request for parole in 2015 was denied. His next review would come in 2022, but he remains locked up to this day. After the trial, Colleen didn't retreat. She didn't isolate herself from society, she moved forward. She enrolled in college and studied accounting. She got married and had a daughter. And even after her marriage ended, she remained committed to building a life beyond the trauma. In the years since her release, Colleen has used her experience to support others. She became an advocate for survivors of abuse, volunteered for crisis helplines, and shared her story to raise awareness about the long shadow of psychological control. She had lost 7 years of her life, nearly a third of it, in silence and darkness. But she refused to lose what remained. Colleen Stan was no longer a prisoner. She survived and chose to live, never returning to the box again.